Most people treat onboarding as paperwork, but the pros treat it as stage one of retention because the first impression isn't just an impression, but it's the signal of value, care, and the attention to detail that they can expect throughout the relationship. And in today's video, I'm going to be going through the secret of onboarding that clients never forget, how I'm actively thinking about this, and how I'm implementing it inside Killer Chaos OS, which is our own internal operating system that governs how we're able to build backend systems. So like always, the main mission of these videos is to build this thinking OS, basically Killer Chaos OS, and ultimately to network with cool people doing cool things at the same time. So most people treat onboarding like a checklist. They send the login details, they share a welcome doc, and they schedule a kickoff call, but then they finish at that. But that's transactional, and it's the bare minimum in my personal opinion. And this is something that I've, taken the approach of saying, hey, if you go to, a restaurant and they put your name on the plate, that attention to detail, shows that they care about what it is that they're actively, bringing to you or serving to you. And how can I ultimately have the same experience, and basically ask the question of saying, hey, within our onboarding process, how can I make it as personal as possible to the point that they never forget? Because I think first impressions are ultimately where you need to spend 80% of your energy, like activation energy, which I learned from a good friend of mine, that spoke about this, to say, hey, 80% of, the initial relationship that you ultimately build comes from the 20%, or just comes solely from the impression that you make when onboarding them. And that's why I treat onboarding, or I'm thinking about onboarding, as, not just a step, but rather is the first real delivery of your brand's promise. And thinking about this of saying, hey, how can we actively tailor make this process? It will take a lot of energy to ultimately personalize this as much as we possibly can. And at this stage, we're not dealing with 100, 200, 300 people, which ultimately then we're going to have to take a different approach. But ultimately, right now in this present moment in time, one of the most important things that I've been asking myself lately is that if I'm able to zoom out, what is the real question that I could ultimately ask through this, which is, how do I make this moment unforgettable? How do I make this onboarding sequence a sequence that they would never forget, even if it's a small thing like saying, hey, like, I'm gonna send you a handwritten note, because solely people just feel the intention through that. And how can I craft this message, or this craft this experience for them, so that they know that they can expect to trust us in the long term, to say, hey, we're not just looking to just take their money and then just provide value, but we're taking the extra mile. We're solely just in it to make sure that we're providing as much value as we possibly can. And if that means going the extra mile, 1000% we're gonna 100% do it. But then we need to also realize that it's in the details where most leverage lies. It's the handwritten note from the founder. So for me, examples to say, hey, thank you so much for trusting us, with your business. We are so excited to get started. And ultimately sending that, founder's letter to them also brings that, hey, they care about what it is that we're bringing to them, and it shows that we're able to go the extra mile, which by far I think now in this day and age, at least from my personal lens, goes a long way in terms of people want to be connected to people. And how do we actively structure this experience and create this experience by making them feel connected to us as well? Because in as much as this can be a business relationship, we need to also make sure that, hey, we're also providing as much value as we possibly can in other means, which is crafting the experience, because all of that small attention to detail makes all the difference. And I think that attention to detail ultimately sets a precedence that, hey, we actively care about your business and we actively care about you, which ultimately leads them to say, hey, we want to invest a lot more into you because you care about us, which ultimately means that, hey, longer, it's going to be much more difficult long term to get rid of us, or to churn per se. And saying, hey, this is not only just a handwritten letter from the founder, it could be a personalized loom showing how their setup was prepared, basically showing them, hey, we've taken the time, we've processed how we see your automation flows, how we see how your business is actively running, and then tailor making a loom video to show how we built their setup, and ultimately making sure that, hey, we're crafting this experience that they also feel involved, because I think also their involvement, if they feel like, hey, we're actively involved, we have input in all these things, that ultimately makes them feel a certain level of care, that hey, they're actively taking attention to detail and we're involved in this project as much as they are. And I think that is the number one thing to show that your clients, that you care about what it is that you're actively bringing to them, by going through the extra mile. And also, you could do this by through a simple small surprise, like a resource that they didn't expect, but immediately they see value in it. So ultimately creating this experience and asking the question of how can we actively create this experience within our onboarding flow, that ultimately shows that hey, we're willing to go the extra mile even in our onboarding call, and through that sets the precedence of what is coming next, because ultimately that holds us to a higher standard. Say hey, they worked with people that just said, hey, here are the logins, here's the welcome doc, and let's just schedule a kickoff call. Ultimately, they come into our world and they're getting personalized notes. They're also getting, a digital brochure or whatever the case may be. And ultimately, they feel a lot more secure in terms of working with you, because they feel that, hey, you are able to do more than the bare minimum. And how can we actively create this experience through that, I think, is one of the most important questions that I want to get super deep on. And this is actively what I'm now starting to implement, which I didn't implement before, to be truly honest with you. But ultimately, I see a lot of value in crafting those experiences, but ultimately in stages, saying, hey, right now we're using XYZ method to show that, hey, we honestly care about your business and the success and growth of your business. But ultimately, how can we also use this as feedback loop to better, better build our onboarding flows, and making sure that, hey, let's say we started with a handwritten note from the founders, then ultimately later on we do a Loom video. Ultimately, also understanding that through this we need to do it in stages, but also gathering feedback, because I think there's going to be a lot of feedback through this to say, hey, we did a handwritten note, and how many people actually appreciated that, by just asking like, hey, did you see the note, and then just ultimately getting their feedback as well, because that sets a brand presence to say, hey, your high value and your perceived value instantly increases. And through that, I think is one of the modes that we need to make sure that we're hitting so hard on, because ultimately that is going to create so much leverage for us, and ultimately just to show that, hey, we're willing to go the extra mile. But through this, it means that these touches don't scale instantly, they take time, thought, and energy. 100%. The 80-20 rule applies here. 80% of the energy that you spend building the relationship is in the initial phases, and then the rest ultimately just comes. So how can we make sure that all the energy that we're spending in the building the relationship, we are spending it in the sense that, hey, they feel trusted, they feel secure in terms of working with us, and they know that, hey, we're gonna hold their brand and what it is that we're gonna build for them to a super high standard. And sure, it's gonna take time to fully perfect this, but ultimately understanding that here is where the leverage is, because when you set a high perceived bar in week one, you ultimately understand that, hey, everything will get judged in that same light. So you basically setting the precedence that, hey, if you say you're the best of the best, then your onboarding flow, or what it is that you actively do in that initial stages of the onboarding, ultimately needs to be the best of the best, and show that, hey, you actively care about what it is that you're actively solving for them, and also their business as well, because through that care, they're willing to invest a lot more into you. And ultimately saying, hey, this is what they actively think, that they think in their minds that if this is how much care they put into onboarding, imagine how much care actual delivery will be. Simply that thought in your mind, in their minds, ultimately fuels how you're going to be building that perceived value, because instantly that makes them trust you more to say, hey, if he's able to do XYZ in the beginning for me, just imagine what he's going to do when it comes to delivery. And through that ultimately scales, because you can also then use that to feed into referrals and saying, hey, that makes churn harder, like I mentioned, because people don't want to leave someone that shows that they actively care about their business. Say someone came from a bad experience, they had a bad experience working with someone, and then that person they move on, and they ultimately say, hey, we're coming to you because we ultimately had a bad experience, and then you show them the best of the best experience, of course it's going to be hard for them to leave, because they know that you're the best of the best for a specific reason, because your onboarding flow is super dialed, even your delivery is super dialed as well, and also just making sure that, hey, each and every single day you make them feel heard and appreciated, and they understand that, hey, if things were to go down, you care about their business as much as they do, and you're ultimately able to then, create as much value as you possibly can for them, because that ultimately means that referrals become easier and lifetime value is does become longer. And understanding that, one of the most important modes, especially, building this, back end systems and what we're building, is ultimately creating that lifetime value. How can we actively show up each and every single day for our clients in a manner that they don't even think or don't even expect, that ultimately builds that lifetime value? And I think that lifetime value is such a understated, compounding effect that we can ultimately create, to say, hey, how can we pay attention to the smallest minute details that ultimately makes our customers or our clients feel heard, to the point that, hey, they're willing to scream our name. And I think a ton of brands, one of the biggest brands ultimately do this. Now it's just asking the question of, how can we do this and also add our own flair? And I think one of the things that we're actively trying out right now is actively working, which is ultimately just bringing a personalized message, and also making sure that, hey, this is what we're gonna give to you, just as an onboarding, to say thank you for entrusting us with your business, and ultimately seeing how that, how that gauges with them, ultimately is going to build the next generation of how we're going to be able to, better this onboarding flow. But also, you need to understand, you all got to start somewhere. And I think where we're starting right now with just a, simple message note where we say, hey, thank you for entrusting us with our business, making sure that, hey, they feel heard, and also just shooting over a Loom video, I think is where, a lot of value is going to be created into the future in terms of the relationship. But that's understanding that, the onboarding isn't a cost center. It's rather the loudest signal of how serious you are in order to take this relationship. How seriously you are willing to take this relationship that you're going to build with them ultimately comes from how you're able to build this onboarding flow that ultimately scales into the future, because referrals become easier, and churn becomes lower, because ultimately you're able to build that lifetime value. Still waiting to see how this is all going to play out in the long run ultimately, but this is how we're actively just thinking about this, and how we're actively implementing this inside how we're able to build backend systems. But through that, we ultimately need to focus on the tactics. And these are the 3 tactical layers for high touch onboarding that we're actively thinking about, which is a personalized founder touch, where we send a 2 to 3 minute Loom video from the founder, which is me, saying, hey, here's exactly what excites me about working with you, and here's how we can expect, with the result of, this ultimately feels rare on their side, it's human, and immediately elevates perceived value. Because I think one of the most important concepts that I mentioned earlier is ultimately building that connection, because people want to be connected to people, and ultimately, even if you're a founder, you appreciate a lot more, especially now with this shift towards founder-led marketing, where you ultimately understand that people buy into people first, and then they buy into their product. And how can you actively use this in order to fuel how we're able to interact with our clients, through just sending this founder touch message, ultimately understanding that, hey, we, or me as the founder, I'm actively super involved in your project on a day-to-day, to the point that, hey, I'm willing to send 2 to 3 minute founder video just to say welcome to the team. Obviously, this is going to change as soon as we decide to scale into the future, to say, hey, we have 200 people. That may not be possible, but ultimately we're going to figure it out when the time comes. But for now, super welcome to just focus on providing as much value as we possibly can in every single aspects. And I know that we're going to fail, but ultimately I think this is the modes that we need to take to show as much level of care that we possibly can, to show, hey, we're willing and we're in it with you in the long run, and not just in the short term. Because I think small attention to detail matters a lot, and through this you ultimately are able to build that perceived value that is important to getting referrals into the future. But not only that, just also just creating a nice, long-term relationship. And also a welcome package basically could be digital, basically a Notion hub with resources, videos, or timelines, and also could be physical, basically a handwritten card, a branded small gift with your specific business's brand kit. And also, either way, you ultimately understand that, hey, it says that we've thought about you before you even asked. And I think this is one of the most important things, to ultimately show that you thought before they even ask. You thought about sending them a branded, gift card that ultimately has your brand, say a notebook, a pen, whatever the case may be, with your branding, to say thank you for joining Onboard. And ultimately that also leaves a digital imprint that, hey, maybe 2 months, 3 months down the line, someone just sees on their desk, this branded book or notebook or whatever the case may be, and says, hey, where did you get that? And then ultimately they say, hey, it's one of the people that we're actively, that is actively solving our backend systems, and through that a new partnership is formed. So you just ultimately need to take care in order to understand that, hey, all those small attention to details can create a long lifetime value in so many different facets. And also understanding that, hey, through this, the personal founder touch and also the welcome package, there's also the 7-day engagement rule, which is something that I, am super bullish on. I've been doing this subconsciously, but now it's just me putting it down to solely just say, hey, this is a 7-day rule of saying, hey, every new client should hear from you at least 3 times in the first week. So not just saying, hey, like, thanks for onboarding, and then you don't speak to them for 2-3 weeks. I'm super bullish on making sure that we're speaking to our clients each and every single day. Well, it doesn't have to be every single day, but I approach it as, hey, we need to have a conversation almost each and every single day, so that we're all aligned on the same thing, saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're updating them check-ins and saying, hey, by the way, we've already gotten started on X, because that shows that, hey, we're proactive in what it is that we're actively doing. And early momentum kills doubt. Ultimately understanding that, hey, if we're able to build this early momentum super early, then we're ultimately able to kill doubts that may form in their minds, in the sense that, hey, maybe I'm not sure about, if this was the right call, having them on board and things like that. Ultimately, that goes a long way. And I've seen it firsthand. Most of these things I've tried out, subconsciously, but now it's taking it to a whole new level and actively just writing down and saying, hey, these are now our sources of truth in terms of how we're going to be reaching out to clients, and also making sure that they feel felt, they feel like they heard and felt and connected as well. Because through this, just actively just building it out like this, I think is ultimately going to scale into the future. And through this, you ultimately, at least I've ultimately understood that if you win in the first week, you often win in the entire contract. And what this means is that, because people don't just remember what you deliver, they remember mostly how you made them feel at the start. And I think this is true, throughout time. I think this is a concept that transverses through time, that people don't remember like what you did or what who you remembered as and things like that. They remember how you made them feel. And I think this is a concept that transverses through time, like I said, that people just remember how you made them feel. So how can we then make them feel welcomed and connected from the initial get-go? Because ultimately that is going to build that lifetime value that is going to scale into the future. And ultimately just making sure that we're providing as much value as we possibly can through this. And I know that into the future it's going to scale to a massive level. And this is something that we're super deep into now, actively implementing in a more strategic way. Before it was just, hey, like, let's do this and this and this, but now it's just structuring it a lot better so that we're able to scale it into the future. And this is something I'm super excited about, because we are ultimately just more focused on the minute details. And I think that is what's going to be able to separate us from what it is that we are competing with, or if you know what I mean. So ultimately understanding that. But yeah, we're going to fail so many times. We're going to get some things wrong, we're going to get some things right, but ultimately the most important thing is that we're going to take action each and every single day, and focused action on the details. And And through that, I know that we're going to get to the grand vision of Chaos Killer OS, where we're going to be inspiring millions of people, redefining industries, and having this $100 million worth of impact, just an arbitrary number, by the way. And through this, we're ultimately going to be able to take one step closer each and every single day. I'm super excited, to the future. Like, we're going to fail so many times. I always say that, but ultimately, one step each and every single day is going to get us closer to that grand vision of Killer Chaos OS. So today is day 86. I'm super excited. New week. Today's Monday. So yeah, I'm super excited to continue the next couple videos and get to day 100. So if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.